Following Dave Ramsey's advice might actually put you in a worse financial position long term. Let me explain. Now, we all know that Dave Ramsey is the king, the wizard, if you will, of financial advice, and most of it I agree with, but there's one thing that I absolutely don't agree with, and that's his advice on buying a home. And that's primarily because some of the rules, if you will, that he has in place when it comes to buying a home, most people just can't do them because of what's required. Now, something I want to be very clear on, I agree with a lot of the rules that he actually has in place. I think they are good metrics if you can actually follow them. But because of where housing affordability is, due to higher interest rates and house prices, the majority of the population would never be able to buy a home if they specifically follow these rules, especially in high-cost areas like Southern California, where I'm located. So what I want to do in today's video is go over these rules with you and give you my thoughts on them where I differ as a real estate agent who's been working with home buyers for the better part of 20 years, because I've had a lot of clients that haven't followed any of these rules. In fact, I didn't personally follow any of these rules when I purchased the home that I own now. And if I had followed them, there's a really good chance that I would have never been able to buy a home. But because I bought when it was the right time in my life and I was comfortable with the monthly payment, had money in the bank, I'm now sitting on more than 100% equity from where I originally purchased my home. In addition to that, I've been able to fix my housing costs in an inflationary environment where rents are continuing to go up, house prices are continuing to go up. In fact, I could rent my home today for $2,000 more than my current mortgage payment. And none of that would have been possible had I followed these rules. So before we dive into the actual rules themselves, I'd like to take a minute and ask a favor. If you find any value in my videos at all, if you support this type of content, support what I do me a favor and hit that thumbs up. Also, feel free to subscribe to the channel to stay updated on everything real estate related. Now, one thing that Dave Ramsey is really big on is being debt-free, essentially paying down all your credit cards, paying off your car payments, your student loans, and having absolutely zero debt. And I strongly agree with that. In fact, I think it's really, really important to have little to no debt. But for the greater majority of the population out there, that's just not possible. But at the same time, you shouldn't be spending your life away on credit cards because you can't pay for it in other places. In fact, you should never be spending more money per month than you're actually bringing in. So with that, he believes that you shouldn't have any debt at all. I don't think that's the case. I think that if you can qualify for the loan, you're comfortable with the monthly payment, including all of your other debts, then ultimately you're the one to decide whether or not you can handle that monthly debt load. And I think for Dave Ramsey, it's simplicity, right? He just says, hey, no debt is the best way to live your life. And I don't disagree with that, but I also don't think it's realistic. And with that said, he believes that you shouldn't start the process of buying a home until all of your debt is paid off and you have 6 months reserves in an emergency fund. Now, I agree with the idea that you should have an emergency fund. You should have funds outside of your down payment as well as your closing costs so that once you close on the home, you actually have some additional money. I don't think that you should be using all of your money to buy a house. I think you'd be setting yourself up for failure if that's the case. So I do agree with the idea that you need to have 3 to 6 months worth of funds, worth of money on the side in order to handle your typical monthly expenses. In addition to that, I also agree with the idea that you need to have your own money to pay for closing costs on the side, that you shouldn't be in a position where you're having to borrow money from other people in order to close on a home. And you also need to have money for moving expenses. Like I said a moment ago, you can't expect to buy a home and not have any expenses. You also need to have money for maintenance items in case something breaks on the house or in the case that something goes wrong and it needs to be replaced. But that's really where I stop agreeing with Dave Ramsey's advice. In fact, the next couple of things I'm going to talk about, I don't necessarily disagree with the idea of it, but I disagree with the concept when people are looking to purchase in higher cost areas. And the main thing I'm talking about here is Dave Ramsey's 25% house rule, which is essentially to calculate how much house you can afford, you more or less take 25% of your monthly take-home pay after taxes are paid, and that's how much money you should end up spending on your monthly mortgage payments. Now, I'm going to tell you that that's absolutely not feasible in most markets out there. And we're going to do some basic calculations here in just a moment, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. But the whole premise behind the idea is that following this advice will more or less keep you safe from buying too much home where you end up in a position being house poor. And I agree with the idea that you shouldn't be house poor. All of your monthly expenses shouldn't be going to your housing payment just because you qualify for it. You need to go into that process with a budget in mind, what you're comfortable spending when talking to that mortgage lender versus the lender telling you how much you can afford to purchase. In fact, if you're watching this video as a first-time home buyer wondering whether or not you can even qualify to buy a home, I created a 90-second quiz. It's a free quiz where you just push a couple of different buttons and ultimately it gives you an idea of whether or not you can qualify for a home. If that interests you at all, do me a favor and check the link below. So if we listen to Dave Ramsey and we only did the 25% house rule, let's take a look at some numbers and how that breaks down. So let's say you make $100,000 per year before taxes. That equates into $8,333 per month. But Dave's rule is that you take 25% of your take-home pay after taxes. Let's say you're in a state where you pay about 20% of your income towards taxes. Now, some areas it's going to be more, some areas it might be a little bit less, but in that case, that's $6,666 after your taxes are taken out. But for this example, we're going to just say $7,000, which puts a little bit more money in your monthly budget. Well, if we followed Dave's advice and we took 25% of that $7,000 to use towards our mortgage payment, that means we could spend a whopping $1,750 per month towards that house. Well, let me just tell you, in most areas of the country, you could buy absolutely nothing with that amount per month. In fact, let's say that we took two pieces of Dave's advice and we were able to buy a $500,000 home. One piece of his advice, which I also don't agree with, and we'll talk about here in just a minute, is that you should have at least 20% down before you purchase a home so that you can avoid the mortgage insurance. Well, in the case that you're able to find that $500,000 home that we talked about, that means that you're financing a $400,000 mortgage. Well, guess what? At today's interest rates of 7%, the mortgage payment on that is $2,661, which, if you remember, is considerably higher than the 25% rule of $1,750. In fact, if we were able to go back in time and buy that same house with interest rates from 2 years ago and say we were able to finance it at 3.5%, the mortgage payment would still be $1,796, which I agree that by doing this, by having the 20% down and only using 25% of your take-home pay, you're putting yourself in a really good financial position, which is really good advice if you have the ability to do that. But I don't believe the majority of people out there do. Now, with that said, I don't believe that you should go out and stretch yourself and do absolutely crazy things to get in a home, but I do believe that you can put less than 20% down when buying a home, have some mortgage insurance. Again, mortgage insurance is not a bad thing if you can't buy a home otherwise. If you have the 20% and you're comfortable putting it down, fantastic. But if you don't, you shouldn't run away from buying a house just because Dave Ramsey tells you that mortgage insurance is bad. In fact, we'll give you some examples here in just a minute. But let's use a similar premise and say that instead of using only 25% of your take home, we use 40% of your take home, which again, I'm not telling you this is the magical number. What I'm saying is that lenders on conventional financing will finance you up to usually a 45 to a 49% debt to income ratio, which is probably higher than most people should finance out there, especially if they have other debt. But it could be the difference in you owning a home versus you renting a home. And I don't believe there's anything with renting. In fact, Dave Ramsey has a really good quote on renting. He says that he believes renting is buying you patience until you're ready to buy a home. And I strongly agree with that. But I also see the direction in which housing is headed. There's not a lot of inventory, and while demand has dropped, it is stable out there. And as we see interest rates come back, what we're going to see is buyer demand pick up, and home prices are likely going to continue moving sideways to up, which is going to make housing even less affordable. Now, a moment ago, I mentioned the idea of not waiting until you have 20% down to buy a house. And the reason I say that is because most people can't save fast enough to keep up with appreciation in home prices. In fact, if you were looking to buy the median home right now in the United States, it's sitting somewhere around $426,000, which means that you would need to save $85,200 in order to meet that 20% down requirement. And based on my experience, most people out there aren't going to be able to do that. And that's not the reason that I think it's a bad idea. I just think it's okay to go in with the purchase of a home with a little bit of leverage, put less money down, maybe use some of that money that you had put aside for a down payment and use that to pay off your debt. So now you don't have any monthly debts, but you're financing a little bit more home and you're paying mortgage insurance. And every time I think about this, I think of a client of ours who purchased back in 2020, 2021, and they used an FHA loan and they only put 3.5% down to buy that house. And because homes were appreciating so much, they were actually able to refinance out of that FHA loan into a conventional loan with no mortgage insurance just 6 months later. Had they waited, they probably would have never been able to purchase a home just because of how fast things are moving. Now, again, I don't think that's a reason to run out and buy a house, FOMO and everything that goes around along with it. But as I always say, it's all about buying a home when it's the right time in your life. Now, one thing I do agree with Dave is that you have to have a longer term time horizon. And the reason for this is because home prices don't necessarily go up in a straight line. They might go sideways, they might go down a little bit. And if you only own the home for a short period of time and you're putting only say 3.5% down, that means you haven't really paid down the principal balance on that loan. And when you go to sell it, you're going to have costs to sell those homes. And in many areas of the country, that can range between 5 and 7%, which means that if you only have 5% equity in that property and you go to sell it, you're going to be upside down on that property. And that's why it is good advice to have a longer term time horizon. It's really good advice to put 20% down and only use 25% of your income. But again, for most people out there, that's not realistic. So do what you're comfortable with. Make sure you start with a budget. You itemize your expenses and you see how much you're comfortable spending every single month. By owning a home, you're putting yourself in a position to be one of the people that has a 44 times greater net worth than those renters. That's what it actually comes down to. Homeowners have a 44 times greater net worth than those of renters. And that's because at retirement, nearly 65% of their retirement is tied up in real estate. And the last thing I want to touch on with Dave Ramsey's advice is he says that you need an expert real estate agent to guide you through that process. Someone that understands the market locally where you're located, so they can not only help you understand the value in that market, but also help guide you towards a winning offer. Now, if you're located here in Southern California, I would love to be that person to guide you through that process. My contact information is listed below. But if you're located anywhere else in another state and you need a professional, it might be a real estate agent, it might be a mortgage professional, I've created a referral link below to guide you to someone I know, like, and trust that can guide you through that process. But at the end of the day, buying a home shouldn't be whether Dave Ramsey told you to do it, whether Jeb told you it was a good idea. It should 100% come down to whether or not it's the right time for you. Now, if you're watching this and you're not ready to buy a house now, you think it's later in the future, and you're wondering what you should focus on in the meantime to put yourself in the best position when the time is ready, do me a favor and check out this video here.